Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby, and today we're going to be doing a horror book recommendations video. And I'm so excited to be making this video because this is actually going to be part 7. I've made 6 different recommendation videos like this in the past, and I will have all of them linked down below. But it has been over a year since the last time that I made a horror book recommendations video. And so because it's been such a long time, I actually have 20 books that I want to recommend you in today's video because I have been reading so many incredible horror books within the last year that I actually had to like pick and choose which books I wanted to feature because that's how many amazing horror books I've been reading. So because of that, these are going to be like the best of the best. And I know it's technically after Halloween at this point, but it's spooky season forever in our hearts, right? I also do have the Winterween readathon coming up in the month of January, so I figured if you need some horror book recommendations to read maybe during that readathon, then here are 20 different books that you can think about reading for Winterween. But before we do jump into the recommendations, I just wanted to take a second to thank today's video sponsor, which is Masterclass. And Masterclass is a new sponsor on the channel, and I couldn't be more excited about it because I'm somebody who loves learning. And Masterclass is a membership to classes from the world's best. Members get unlimited access to over 200 courses and thousands of lessons across business, writing, science and tech, health and wellness, cooking, and more, all for just $10 a month billed annually. I really love that you're able to stream these classes anytime and at your own pace. You can even do audio mode only, and then you can listen to it like it's a podcast. You can watch when you're at home or when you're on the go, and you can even download select classes to your device so that you can watch it when you're offline. They have new classes that get added every single month, and I love the idea of turning spare moments that you have into progress, because you can replace the time that you spend mindlessly scrolling with content that's going to help you grow personally and professionally. I have recently started taking this creative writing class that is taught by Margaret Atwood herself, like the actual Margaret Atwood, you know, author of The Handmaid's Tale. And in this class, she not only talks about her experiences with writing, but she shares her advice, and she talks about how to hook readers with her timeless approach to storytelling. I am somebody who is very passionate about creative writing, and I was actually going to college, like my major was going to be creative writing. And so taking this class has just completely renewed my love for creative writing, and it makes me feel all inspired and like I want to learn everything all over again. And if you're also interested in taking writing classes, like I was actually mind blown by the amount of authors that I recognized that are teaching classes on Masterclass. I mean, we have N.K. Jemisin, we have R.L. Stein, we have Roxane Gay, we have Dan Brown. There's also a class from Mindy Kaling that's talking about script writing. Oh my god, there are just so many classes that I am dying to take because they all sound incredible. During this holiday season, you can get up to 50% off an annual Masterclass subscription. Just click the link in this video's description, or you can scan the QR code on the screen so that they know I sent you. Learn from the world's best to become your best with Masterclass. Thank you so much to Masterclass for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get into the book recommendations. Alright, so kicking off this list with one of my favorite horror books that I read last year, and that is Incidents Around the House by Josh Malerman. You know, after reading this book, I was convinced that this is my favorite book from Josh Malerman, which is saying a lot because I actually do think Josh Malerman might be like my favorite horror author. I don't know, it's tied between him and like maybe 2 other people, but like I am so obsessed with this book. And what I think is so impressive about this book is that we're following from the perspective of this 8-year-old girl named Bella, also starting to see this creature that she calls Other Mommy that lives in her closet, and now Other Mommy is starting to ask her every day, can I go inside your heart? This was such a unique book because we're following from the perspective of this 8-year-old girl for this entire book. The way that this book describes Other Mommy is just so creepy and so terrifying, and it's even more wild because, you know, Bella is just like an 8-year-old kid and she doesn't even really understand how creepy this is. Like, she just kind of thinks that like Other Mommy is like her friend and that this is all like totally fine and normal. So it almost adds to the creepiness because Bella isn't even aware how weird this situation is. But the way that this book describes Other Mommy, like, oh my god, it was so creepy. I was reading this book in the dark and I would get like full shivers down my spine. But then also this book actually made me emotional. Like, the ending had me bawling my eyes out, and I just felt so attached to these characters. I especially loved Bella's dad in this book. Oh my god, he was just so sweet, and I just loved the way that he would parent her and the way that he would talk to her about the world. It was actually just so beautiful and so like hard-hitting in a way that I was not expecting, so I highly recommend Incidents Around the House. Another one of my top favorite horror books that I read last year has got to be We Used to Live Here. In this story, we're following this queer couple named Charlie and Eve, and one day Eve is home alone and this whole family shows up on their doorstep and they're like, hey, we used to live here, can we take a look around your house? And Eve is like such a people pleaser that she doesn't know how to say no to them, so she lets them into the house, and then things just really get chaotic and spiral from there. And I don't want to say too much, but this book is absolutely insane. This book is one of those books that is definitely gonna like fuck with your mind, and it's gonna make you feel so disoriented, and it's gonna make you question reality and like what is even going on. And something that I think is so cool about this book is that it actually includes some Morse code throughout the book that you can kind of like solve as you're reading. This is also definitely one of those books where like after you finish reading this, you're probably gonna want to go on like a deep dive on Reddit to try and see what everybody's saying about it and like try to understand different theories that people have. This one is definitely one of my favorite horror books that I've ever read, and it's so exciting because this is actually a debut from this author Marcus, and he has a new book coming out next year that I cannot wait to read. And you know what's really cool is that both of these books were actually both booktube picks last year, so I do have live show discussions for both of these. If you're interested, I will have them linked down below. One of my favorite horror books that I've read this year has got to be When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. This one actually was also a booktube pick earlier this year, so I will have that live show linked down below as well. I know I've been having some really good success with like the horror books for my book club. It's amazing. This is another book that I read that I just like knew that this was going to be like one of my top favorite horror books that I've read this year because I loved this so much. And Nat Cassidy is also one of the authors that's like in the running right now to be like my favorite horror author. I've just really enjoyed almost every single thing that I've read from Nat Cassidy, and this one was so powerful and so hard-hitting and so unexpected because in this story we're following this woman named Jess, and she is a struggling actress, and right at the start of this book she runs into this little boy that's like in her front yard hiding in the bushes, and he's only like 5 years old or something, and she's like, what's going on? And then there's this really horrifying incident that happens right outside of her apartment where this little boy's father is coming to get him, and she thinks that he's so angry and like scary and she doesn't know what's going on with him. And then this story is kind of about how this girl Jess and this little boy are on the run. I can guarantee you that this book is going to shock you in one way or another because the plot of this book is like nothing I've ever read before in my life. Saying anything more would be a spoiler, but like how do you even talk about this book? Because everything I just told you happens within the first like 20 to 30 pages. And then from that point on, you're like, where's this going? What is happening? I do think this is going to go down as one of the best horror books of 2025, and that's for so many reasons, but it's because this book is absolutely shocking. Like when I say I've read nothing like this book before, I mean that. This book was just so unique in the style of horror, but it's also like very hard hitting, you know, because a lot of this horror revolves around like this little boy who's afraid of his dad, you know, and like that's a very real and like scary thing. And like, oh my god, the ending of this book just absolutely broke my heart. And like Nat Cassidy has such a way with words. I love when he includes these author's notes and like these afterwords at the end of this book that kind of talk about why he wrote it and like how it connects to his life and why it's so personal to him. And like those always make me cry. Like he's just such a great writer, and I loved this one so much. The next recommendation is going to be A Short Stay in Hell. This one is actually a horror novella. It's only about 104 pages, and this is one that I don't even know if it fully fits into the horror genre. It's definitely more like philosophical and like existential horror is what I've heard it described as. This was a reading experience like nothing I've ever had in my life. Oh my god, this was so strange. But what I love about this is that we're following a character who has recently just died, and he finds himself in hell, and it's so hard to even describe, but basically in the hell that this character is in, he's in this vast library that has every book that's ever been published and could ever be published in this library. So it just goes on and on and on forever. Like it's an endless, infinite library. And this book made me feel so much dread and like despair, and like it just made me feel awful, but like in the best way, if that makes any sense. This is just the kind of horror book that really like makes you think about your life and like how short and like small and insignificant our lives are on this planet, and like how short of time we have. And it just really makes you think about like eternity and like what comes next and like what's after this and like what is the meaning of it all, you know. Like it's definitely one of those like existential crisis horror books that really makes you think. Another one of my favorite horror books that I read this year has got to be Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zhang. This one is a horror book that was so hard hitting actually, and just so well written, because in this story we're following this character named Cora who has recently lost her sister, and her sister died in a really awful way because she ended up dying in the subway in New York City when this guy pushed her in front of the moving train and said Bat Eater. And this book is also taking place in 2020 during like the craziness of the COVID pandemic, you know? And this book really touches on how difficult it was not only to like live through the COVID pandemic while living in a city like New York, but also specifically the Asian experience and how much hate and racism Asians were experiencing during that time. I just think this book is so hard hitting, but it's also just so gory and grotesque and weird, and there's like fever dreamy moments, and I just loved everything about this. Like this is definitely one of my favorite horror books that I've read this year. I think I also really connected with this because of like the sister relationship, even though their relationship is very complicated in this book, and she talks about feeling a lot of, you know, regret because it's like she never really felt like she knew her sister, and like now she can never make things right with her. So there's a lot of grief horror that's explored in this one as well, and I just thought, oh my god, it was so well done. Another 5-star horror book that I had this year is What Hunger? And in this story we're following this young girl named Ronnie, and she has this older brother Tommy who is like the golden child, and everything that she does gets compared to her brother Tommy. And after a really horrifying incident happens to her family, she starts starts to spiral out of control basically, and she starts to develop this hunger for raw meat. So naturally, you know, this book had some of the most grotesque and like vivid imagery of this girl eating this raw meat. It was so disgusting. But I also think this book was just so well done because this definitely fits into the category of like female rage and like something awful happening to this young girl that like makes her spiral into madness. I also think if you liked the book The Eyes Are the Best Part, I think you would absolutely love What Hunger, because I noticed a lot of similarities with these two, because you know, in this book she develops this hunger for, you know, eyeballs, and then in this book it's raw meat. And so both of these stories will make you feel very uncomfortable for like similar reasons, but also because both of these stories are following very young teenage girls who are both Asian as well, and you learn a lot about their culture throughout the book. I mean, in this one the character's Korean, and then in this one the character's Vietnamese, but I do think there are so many similarities between these two, and like this was a 5-star book for me last year, this was a 5-star for me this year, and I just think if you liked The Eyes Are the Best Part, you need to read What Hunger. Another horror novella that I absolutely loved has got to be Walking Practice, and this one is actually a Korean translated horror book. In this story we're following this shape-shifting alien, and it's kind of about how they're like trying to figure out how to walk, they're trying to figure out how to fit in with humanity, and they're also like using dating apps to find people to eat so that they can survive. And this was such a wild book. I would highly recommend the audiobook for this one, by the way, because the way that this narrator was narrating the thoughts of this alien, like it was cracking me up. Like it was so funny. But also like this book is really dark, you know, it's really gory, it's really gruesome, but it's also got this like undertone of like a dark comedy thing happening, and it was just so funny at times. And there's also, if you do have the physical book, there's a lot of different illustrations included throughout the book of this alien, which I thought was also really cool. I also think this book just had so much interesting and like thought-provoking social commentary, especially when it comes to like gender with like humans and like how obsessed we are with gender, and like reading from the perspective of an alien who has no gender. Like that was just really interesting and so well done. Another horror book that I so recently just read is The Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre. Oh my gosh, this book was so incredible and it was so unexpected. Like I was not expecting to love this book as much as I did. I think it's mostly because this book is a slasher, and like usually when it comes to slasher horror, it's not my favorite genre to read. I mean, I do enjoy watching slashers when it comes to movies, but like for some reason in books, sometimes I can find it to be a little bit boring, to be honest. But this has got to be one of the best slashers that I've ever read, because in this story we're following this woman named Rose, and she's in her late 70s. She's living at this retirement home, and she's starting to believe that there is a serial killer on the loose at this retirement home, because all of her friends are dying in the most suspicious and gruesome ways. People dying in a retirement home isn't exactly something that's going to turn heads. I just really love the way that this author talks about like the elderly community and how like so often the needs of the elderly just get overlooked. And there was just something about this book that like really touched me. I think it's just the way that it was written. There were so many beautiful quotes talking about like what happens later in life. I mean, with writing like this, when it says, "When it's time, death simply taps you on the shoulder, whispers softly in your ear, and slips its icy hand into yours. For the residents of Autumn Springs Retirement Home, death isn't a horror movie. It's an inevitability. Sometimes it's even a comfort, and sometimes it's even a friend." Like, God, that is so beautiful. Like, how could that not make me emotional? I see a lot of people comparing this to like Thursday Murder Club, and I can definitely see why. I would also compare this to like We Spread by Ian Reid, or like Too Old for This by Samantha Downing. Like, it definitely has similar vibes to those for me. And I'm just loving seeing more books getting published that follow a protagonist that's like a little bit older, you know, like in her 70s. It's just very refreshing. And this book was just absolutely incredible, and it made me emotional, and it's so good, and I highly recommend it. And while we are on the subject of slashers, I thought I would recommend another slasher that I really loved this year, and that's Breathe In, Bleed Out by Brian McCauley. This is another one that was obviously very unexpected for me to love it as much as I did, because, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of slashers, but this was everything that I've ever wanted in a slasher. This book felt so inspired by Scream, but like in the best way possible. And I think this book actually was heavily inspired by Scream, because there's actually an author's note at the end of this book that says, "Scream with me," and he talks about how Scream really inspired him. And I just love this author's writing so much, because I feel like a lot of his books are inspired by like really iconic horror films, and I love that. And so in this book, we're following this character named Hannah, and she is still recovering from this very traumatic incident that she had. Basically, she went on this wilderness trip with her fiance, that was this guy named Ben, and on this trip, her fiance Ben died, and it was very gruesome, and now it's been about a year, and she's still haunted by that night, and Ben's ghost is like still lingering around, like he's still haunting her, she's still seeing him everywhere. And so then her friend suggests that they go to this spiritual retreat that's a Joshua Tree, and so this is about how her and her friend are going to be going to this retreat in the middle of the desert, and then some freaky shit starts happening while they're in the desert, desert and they start to feel like they're getting picked off one by one and like there's a killer around them. This book was just so entertaining. I loved all of the characters in this, and it really did feel like Scream because there were so many like unexpected little twisty things that I was like, wait, what? Another horror book that I really want to recommend to you is going to be House of Leaves, and I'm so excited that I can finally recommend this to you because I've finally read it, and I'm so glad that I finally read it because I actually really enjoyed this, like even more than I thought I was going to. This book has got to be one of the most disorienting and like weird horror books that I've ever read, but it's really something that has like stuck with me after all of these months because premise-wise, all you need to know about this is that you're following these characters who are living in this house that appears as if it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And that's all you really need to know about this. This book is so strange, it's so bizarre. There's a lot of like story within a story happening in this book too because there's these footnotes that like spill into the next page and it's like a story within a story. It's very confusing and a lot of the reading experience doesn't make any sense. Like there's a lot of moments in this book where you have to like hold it up to the mirror to like even be able to read what's happening on the page. This book really was such a wild reading experience. I do have an entire vlog that I posted just to my Patreon about my experience reading this book, and I do jump into like spoilers and a lot of my thoughts on things, so I'll have that link down below if you want to see it. But yeah, House of Leaves is definitely worth the hype. This book is so bizarre. Another 5-star horror novella that I want to recommend is Pocket Knife Kitty by Shannon Riley. I especially want to recommend this because I feel like this book has almost no readership because on Goodreads it just has so little reviews and ratings, so I definitely want to recommend this as something you should go and pick up and check out because this was so crazy. So in this story, we're following this woman named Jamie who's about 31 years old. She goes out to this bar one night and she meets this guy. They end up going home together, and then after they share a night together, some very weird and awful and disgusting things start happening to her and she can't explain why. She doesn't know what's going on. This was so unhinged in like the best way, and this had some of the most gruesome like body horror things. I was actually disgusted. I think I read half of this book with my mouth hanging open like like I can't even imagine. Like this is actually my worst nightmare. And it says on the back this is exploring themes of sexual empowerment, revenge, and loneliness, and I definitely agree. I also think if you like the movie It Follows, I think you would absolutely love this. There was a moment that happened at the end of this book that I was like screaming and cheering and clapping because I was like, yes, bitch. So I loved this. I also think if you like Eric LaRocca's writing style, I do think you would like this one as well. I don't know, there was just something about this. It really worked for me, so I highly recommend you check it out. Speaking of gruesome body horror, I also want to recommend You Weren't Meant to Be Human by Andrew Joseph White, because in this story we're following this character named Crane who is a trans man, and right at the start of this book he finds out that he's pregnant, and Crane actually belongs to this thing called the Hive, and the Hive is like demanding the child from him, so he can't even get rid of the child. And this book made me feel a lot of things, but it mostly honestly made me feel very sad, you know, because I do think this is a book that has a lot of very heavy subject matter, obviously, with like a trans man getting pregnant. I feel like that is a very emotionally charged thing to even happen, but like god, this book was so gorgeously written. Like the writing in this was so beautiful, and there were some scenes in this that had me so squeamish that I had to like skim ahead a little bit. I'm not even gonna lie, like it was pretty brutal at times, but the horror in this was just so good. And if you do like, you know, pregnancy horror, because like I will admit pregnancy horror is like one of my least favorite things to read about, but like I still loved this one so much. It was just the writing in this was so good, and I felt really connected to Crane as a character, and so I think that's also part of the reason why I loved it so much. All right, this next recommendation is for anybody looking for more vampire fiction in their life because it's Coffin Moon. Oh my god, is this not one of the most beautiful book covers you've ever seen? Like I am obsessed with this. I love it. So in this story, it's taking place in the winter of 1975 and it's taking place in Portland, Oregon. We're following this character named Dwayne, and he's recently back from this tour in Vietnam. He's also a recovering alcoholic who is running a bar. He's recently taken in his 13-year-old niece named Julia, and it says then a vampire walks into his bar and ruins his life. And so we're also following from the perspective of this vampire named John Varley. He walks into the bar and he kind of has like an issue with Dwayne, and they're kind of like fighting each other, and so then John retaliates by brutally killing his wife, which is not a spoiler by the way. It talks about this all in the description of the book. But basically this story is about how Dwayne and his young niece Julia are going to be hitting the road because they're going to be trying to find this vampire who killed his wife. This book was just so atmospheric. It was so gorgeously written, and I feel like this is the kind of story that definitely feels like it's more character driven than anything. I just felt so connected to not only Dwayne and then his niece Julia, but also this vampire character John Varley. Oh my god, he was such a cool character to follow. I also loved that there were so many queer characters in this book. Like that was not something that I was expecting, and it just made me love the book even more. I do think this book started to lose me a little bit towards the end, just in terms of like what kind of horror was happening. Like wasn't exactly my favorite, but I still think that if you're looking for like a fun vampire story that feels very original, I would highly recommend Coffin Moon. I thought it was such a fun time. I also want to recommend recommend my favorite Rachel Harrison book that I've read so far, and that's Play Nice. I am so relieved that this one went well because I feel like every single October I get the urge, I get FOMO, and I want to read the new Rachel Harrison, even though I haven't had the best luck with her in the past. But this has got to be by far my favorite book that I've read from her so far. And what I love about this story is that we're following this character named Cleo, and right at the start of this book, her mother actually passes away and leaves behind this home where her and her sisters grew up in, but her sisters want nothing to do with this house, and so Cleo kind of takes it upon herself to like go back to the house. But what I love about this book is it's also kind of like a story within a story, because people believe that the home that they grew up in was haunted, and her mother had actually written a book about the haunted house that they grew up in. And so in between Cleo's chapters, we do get chapters that are from like her mother's book, and we get to read about what happened. Oh my gosh, this one totally reminded me of like Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, which is like one of my favorite books ever. But this book also had a really cute romance in it that I actually ended up caring about a lot, which is not something I would usually ever say about horror books. Like, I don't ever seek out romance in my horror books, but this one was really good. Like, it was written really well and I really cared. Another book that I was not expecting to love as much as I did has got to be Another by Paul Tremblay. And I wasn't sure if I would like this because Paul Tremblay in general has been kind of a hit or miss author for me, but I wasn't sure if I would like this one, especially because it's middle grade, and it's not often that I read middle grade horror, and so I wasn't really sure what to expect with this, but this was so brilliant. It was so well done. And in the story, we're following this young boy. I want to say he's like 12 or 13 years old, and it actually takes place during the COVID pandemic, so he's feeling very isolated. You know, he's doing school from home, and then one day his parents bring home a friend for him that's basically this thing that's like made out of clay. It's almost like a mannequin type of thing, and it's just so creepy and so freaking weird. And I loved the direction that this book ended up going in. Like, when I realized what was happening in the book, I was like, oh my god, no way. I was like, that's genius. Like, that's brilliant. Like, I love that. This book just really hits close to home, I think, because of how realistic it feels with, like, I can't imagine how awful it was to be like a young kid during the pandemic and just kind of sitting at home being so isolated from your friends. I feel like this author did such a great job with like capturing that specific kind of loneliness, and it was just so well done. Another one that I want to highly recommend is going to be 13 Months Haunted by Jimmy Giuliano. This is another book troop book club pick that I had this year that went so well. So if you wanted to see the live show for that, I will have it linked down below, because in this story we're following this librarian named Piper, and the story's kind of taking place in like the late 90s and the early 2000s. There's this young girl in school named Avery, and all the other kids like think she's so weird, and they all make fun of her because her mom comes to school with her every single day, and they think that her mom is a witch. And there's also all of these rumors that like the house that she grew up in must be haunted because her dad and her sister died in very mysterious ways, and they think it's because of the haunted house. I love books like this that have a lot of nostalgia for like the late 90s and the early 2000s. Like, that's just something that I really have been seeking out lately, and I love how unique the horror in this book felt to me, because I've personally never really read anything in horror that deals with this specific type of haunting before. Like, it was just so cool. I feel like Piper as a protagonist, like sometimes she could get on my nerves a little bit just because I thought she was being really naive about certain things, but I do think for the most part this was a really entertaining read, and I especially loved the epilogue. Oh my god, the epilogue was so fun. It like gave me chills all over my body. I was like, let's go. And then speaking of, you know, 90s nostalgia, I would also recommend Lost Man's Lane by Scott Carson. This one takes place in 1999 for the most part, so it definitely has that like late 90s nostalgia. And in this story, we're following this character named Marshall Miller, and right at the start of this book, there's a scene where like he just got his driver's license and he's driving down the road and he gets pulled over by this cop that is like very strange, and he sees this young girl in the back of the cop car who's like sobbing, and she looks very unwell, and he doesn't think much of it until he gets home and he realizes that there is no cop in their small town named Maddox, and also that this young girl that he saw in the back of the car is now missing. And so this book is kind of about how like he's starting to like unravel some of these secrets in his small town and like what's really going on. I don't even know how to pitch this book in a way that sounds interesting, to be honest, but like this was just so good. It had this like coming of age feel to the writing that I just really loved and really connected with. I also just really loved following Marshall as a character, and like he had a really cute relationship with his single mother, and like their bond was just really sweet. There's a lot of really sweet friendships that you read about in this book as well. I think if you're looking for something that's going to make you feel really nostalgic for that time period, but then also like the writing style is very comparable to Stephen King. Like, I just kept feeling like this could have been something Stephen King wrote. So I think if you're looking for something like that, I would highly recommend checking out this one. And then I also really want to recommend this book by David Sodergren called Rotten Tommy. I've read almost everything by David Sodergren at this point, and Rotten Tommy is definitely one that has stayed on my mind almost all year. This is one that really stuck with me because it deals with one of my favorite horror tropes, and that's when there's like this weird, eerie children's show that like nobody really really remembers, but like something was just off about it. There's like a very specific eeriness with that I just really like. I think if you liked the book Knock Knock Open Wide, I do think this is another one that you might like because it has like a similar feeling to it. I also think the idea of this like rotten Tommy thing really freaked me out. Like it was really starting to get to me. I feel like David Sodergren is one of those authors where like he really is able to balance the tone very well of like genuinely creepy scenes, but then a mix of some scenes that feel more like campy and kind of silly. The only reason why I didn't end up rating this one a little bit higher is because the last third of this book got a little bit too like campy silly for my taste. Like I wanted it to just be a little bit more creepy in the end, but this is still one that I've been thinking about nonstop all year, and I have to recommend it because it was just so unique and so weird. I also really want to recommend the book Suffer the Children. This is a backlist book that I actually just read for the first time this year, and I was so impressed by how good this book was because this book deals with a very unique kind of like apocalyptic situation that only affects kids. So like literally within an hour, every single child on the planet dies almost at the same time, and you're kind of following from the perspective of so many different people and like so many different situations, and I like that you're following the story as it's happening. Like there's like a countdown when it's like 1 hour until the event and like 30 minutes until the event. And then you kind of get to see this frantic chaos as it's happening where like all these kids are just dropping like flies and they're like, what's going on? And I think the way that this writer approached the subject was very interesting because I feel like it was a very realistic look at like what would happen to our society if this actually happened. Like what would this mean for future generations? What would this mean for the adults? What would this mean for future kids? It was just very interesting and like very thought-provoking in that way. But then the real horror begins when all of those kids rise again. And then it starts to feel very like Pet Sematary, like very creepy, very bizarre. Oh my god, this was just such a thought-provoking one, and I had to recommend it because I've been thinking about this book all year long. And then the last horror book that I wanted to recommend is actually going to be a short story collection, and that is One Bad Night and Other Stories. And the reason why I wanted to put this at the end of the video is because unfortunately you can only get this book right now through Aardvark Book Club, and I think Aardvark is only currently shipping to the US and Canada, so like hopefully at some point they can expand and like maybe make this available digitally or something so that everybody can have access to this, because this is a collection of short stories by 8 different horror authors, and like there are so many iconic horror authors. Just to name a few, we have Stephen Graham Jones, Jennifer Thorne, CJ Lead, Rachel Harrison, Kylie Lee Baker, S.A. Barnes. Like there are so many iconic names on that list, and I have read from 6 of the 8 authors before, so I was really looking forward to this. And what I really loved about this collection of short stories is that there are so many different kinds of horror that are explored throughout this book, because we have horror that feels more like psychological horror, we have grief horror, we have like creepy like aquarium kind of like monster horror, we have space horror, like there's one of these stories that take place on the moon, there's horror that feels a little bit more fantasy, and then there's horror that feels a little bit more historical. I just love the diversity among these 8 different stories, and I thought they were all so unique and so different. I think by far though my favorites in the collection have got to be my Lithopedia, which I gave 5 stars, and then I also loved The One Bad Night by Stephen Graham Jones. That one was so hard-hitting and almost made me emotional, but this is such an impressive collection of short stories, and I really hope that Aardvark does something like this again in the future because I ate this shit up. I loved it so much. So I will have the link for Aardvark Book Club linked down below if you want to go and check out this book, but I'm so sorry, it's only available through their website, so that is a little bit annoying, but this collection was so good, I had to mention it here. Alright, so those are the 20 horror books that I want to recommend to you today, and the way that I even had to narrow this down, like I have another list of about 15 horror books that I want to recommend on top of this, so the next round of horror book recommendations is probably going to come sooner rather than later because I have so many I still want to talk about. But I would love to know your thoughts on any of these horror books. Are these also some of your favorites? Are you adding any of these to your TBR? Definitely let me know. I would also love any horror book recommendations for like some of your favorite horror books that you've read this year that might not be mentioned on this list. And once again, I will have every previous time that I've done this linked down below because I've done so many horror book recommendation videos in the past, including videos like horror book recommendations for beginners, and then I've also done like my all-time favorite horror books. I will have those linked down below. And also, if you are going to be participating in Winterween in the month of January, that's like a spooky readathon that I host twice a year. I host Winterween in January and then I host Summerween in July. And Winterween is going to be happening once again in the month of January. I'll have the announcement linked down below if you missed it. And it's not too late to get merch if you're thinking about getting merch because look at how freaking cute it looks on a crew neck. I am just dead. And I also think it's perfect because this time for Winterween, we're going to be doing like a vampire type of theme. It's going to be Winterween Bloodbath. So I think some of these books would actually be really perfect to read during the readathon. But that's all from me. So thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you next time with a new video. Bye.